Swifters, this is a far less polished video than my normal Swift videos because it is a solutions video covering as quickly as possible the solutions for our Swift heavy midterm exam. So this is a very first programming class. The students that have taken this class have not necessarily taken a collegiate programming class before it. This is a midterm that focuses largely on Swift concepts. My students take this in a single 2.5-hour class setting with their laptops. They get one page of double-sided notes. They can put whatever they want on that. It's always tough to figure out how to test someone, but I've been teaching iOS for several years, and this seems like a good compromise that has prepared our students well and make sure that they have a decent amount of recall knowledge so that they're not just searching all over at test time. Now, if you're experienced, you might also notice that some of these answers can be significantly refactored. I wrote them with very basic programming logic using simple Swift statements, but since I always want my students to learn at every opportunity, I'll modify some of the answers that I'm about to show you after we get the basic answer to show, and we'll use this as a chance to introduce some functional programming concepts, including map, filter, reduce, and forEach. Now, there's also a very simple app that the students had to build as part of this midterm as well. It's a Magic 8-Ball style Halloween app, and the solution for that will be in the video that I'll post after this one. So the first part of the exam takes place in a bunch of solutions inside of a single playground named Europe, and then after that, we're going to build a very simple app. So let's set up our playground first. I also asked my students to start out with a couple of comments so I can identify their work. Now, these questions in the playground use some data, and instead of having my students type in lots of data that are going to be used in arrays and in arrays of structs, you can just visit this URL, bit.ly/swift-europe, all lowercase, and you can copy the data from there. Now, you can pause to fully read all of these questions, but for the first question, what we're going to do is create a bunch of arrays. So a string array named name, a string array named region, a double array named cost of living, and a double array named restaurant price index. So back in the Google Doc with the data, I'm going to highlight and copy all of the text strings that are underneath name. And inside of my playground, I'll say var name equals open bracket, and then paste in all of those strings. Make sure that there's not a comma after the last string, and then make sure that the closing bracket lines up. Then I'll create my region array, var region equals open bracket, copy and paste the data. Then we'll do the same with var cost of living equals open bracket, go and copy. These are going to be all doubles. I'll paste that in. Then we have var restaurant price index equals open bracket, copy and paste the data. Question 1 is done. I'll put commas in for question 1 and question 2, and for question 2, you can see that we're printing out a phrase that says there are X countries in Europe, where X is the number of countries listed in the name array. So the questions start out super easy. I'm just going to put in a statement that says print Q2, and then print there are string interp countries in Europe, and inside the string interpolation, all we need to put in here is names.count. Whoops, that's name, not names.count. At least according to this data, there are 40 countries in Europe. Then we're going to create a struct called country. That's upper camel case because structs are types. It's going to hold 3 properties. They should be declared but not initialized. Name a string, region a string, cost of living a double, and restaurant price index a double. And notice that all our properties are lower camel case. And so for Q3, we say struct, capital country, open and close curlies, var name colon string, var region colon string, var cost of living colon double, and var restaurant price index colon double. Again, we declared these, but we didn't initialize these. Question 3 is done. Question 4 is just to create an empty array of the country struct, and this array should be named countries. There are a couple of ways to do this, but we'll use Apple's preferred method, var countries colon, and then in brackets the country struct, and then equals, and then open and close square brackets. Now for question 5, we're going to use the different arrays that we created in the earlier part of this exam to populate that empty countries array that we just created. There should be one element for each country, and that should contain the name, region, cost of living, and restaurant price index. So for question 5, we'll use a for loop, and we're going to need an index because we're going to need to index 4 different arrays to populate this empty array. For I in 0 ... I'll say less than symbol name.count and open and close curlies. And then inside we'll say lowercase countries dot append. And then inside the parentheses we'll say capital country, which is the name of the struct that we created. Then when we select an open paren, we can see the option to create a new country has us entering a name, region, cost of living index, and restaurant price index. And the count of name is the same as the count of region, cost of living, and restaurant price index, so we can just say name bracket I bracket, region bracket I bracket, cost of living bracket I bracket, and restaurant price index bracket I bracket. Then remember, you can pause if you need to read this more thoroughly, but for question 6, we're going to create a function named region count. It should accept a single parameter named countries, which is an array of the country struct. And then what we should do is we should count up the country in each of the 4 regions and print out there are X countries in Northern Europe, Y countries in Southern Europe, Z countries in Western Europe, and N countries in Eastern Europe, and then call the function passing in the array countries that we just populated in the earlier question. So for Q6, I'm going to print an empty string just to give me some space between the previous answers I'd printed out. Then I'll print out Q6. Then we'll set up our function with func region count and in parentheses countries colon and then in bracket country. So that'll pass in an array of country struct. Then in between curlies, we'll declare 4 variables that we'll use to count up the number of countries in each region. So we'll say var n Europe count equals 0, var s Europe count equals 0, var e Europe count equals 0, var w Europe count equals 0, and then we'll simply loop through all of the countries, and we'll create a switch statement that will look at the particular region of a country, and it will increment the values that we created above if the country is a part of that region. So first we'll loop through all the countries, for country in countries, and then in between the curlies we'll have our switch statement, and we're going to switch on country.region, and then in between the curlies we're going to check for 4 cases, case, and then in quotes n period Europe, and colon, and then if that's the case, we'll set n Europe count plus equals 1, which is adding 1 to that value. Then I'm just going to copy these first lines for the first case, paste it down 4 times down below. I'm also going to add a default because we don't have an exhaustive set of conditions here, and the default will just be colon break. And then I'll change the Northern Europe case to Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, making sure that I'm incrementing my correct count variable. Then after the loop, we'll print and we'll say there are string interp countries in Northern Europe, and inside the string interp, I'll say n Europe count, and then I can copy this line, paste it 3 times down below, and I'll make sure that I change each of these lines so it refers to Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe, and also making sure that the print statement is S, E, and W as well. Then I'll call this function, which is region count, and I'm going to pass in countries, and we can see that we have 10 countries in Northern Europe, 14 in Southern Europe, 9 countries in Eastern Europe, and 7 countries in Western Europe. 40 total. Nice. Now, as a bonus, even though we didn't cover functional programming the first few weeks of class, I want to show you a technique that allows us to accomplish the same thing in fewer lines of code. Now, there are actually a few different approaches to do this, but the one that I'm going to show you now is using filter. So the filter method allows us to create a new array by filtering out only the values or the elements of an array that match a particular criteria. So for example, we can filter out an array, creating a new array where the region property equals Northern Europe. So instead of creating variables to hold the integer, which is a count, I'm just going to change the names here so that we get rid of the count, and we'll use these new variables to hold actual arrays, which are a subset of elements that match the 4 different regions. And here's how we get that. We simply say countries, our original array, dot filter, and then in parentheses, add open and close curlies, and then in between the curlies, we're going to add our criteria. So we'll say $0. That's a weird syntax, but it represents each element in the countries array one by one. Then dot region, so we're looking at the region property of each individual element in the array, and then we'll say equals equals, so we're checking to see if the region property equals, and then in quotes n period Europe. So what it'll do here is it'll extract all elements of the array where that element's region property equals n Europe. Then I'll just highlight and copy that, paste it down 3 times over the previous 0 values, and I'll change Northern Europe and all of these to S Europe, E Europe, and W Europe. Then I can delete the for loop with the switch case statement, and inside of the string interp and the print statements, I'm just going to print out nEurope.count, sEurope.count, eEurope.count, and wEurope.count. And when I run again, I can see I get the exact same values with far less code. The warning that I'm getting up here just says that, hey, I don't change these values so that I can turn them into constants with less if I wanted to. So hopefully you're learning new things even during our exam review. Now on to question number 7. We're going to write a function named average cost of living that accepts a single parameter. That's going to be countries, which is the array of country structs, and this should return a single value. That's the average cost of living for all the countries passed to this function. Then we're going to write another function that does pretty much the same thing, but for the average restaurant index, and then we should call both of these, printing out the average cost of living in Europe is X, and the average restaurant price index in Europe is Y. So I asked students to set up each question with comments and print statements. We set up this first function as func, AVG cost of living, and in parentheses countries, colon, and then in bracket it's country, that's the name of our struct. And then after the close parenthesis, we're going to write an arrow with a dash and a greater than symbol. This means the function is going to return a value. That's going to be a double, and open and close curlies. Then inside our function, if we're going to average up values, well, we need to get a sum. So first we'll start out with the variable sum equals 0.0, and then in a for loop, we'll go through all of our countries. We'll say for country in countries, and in between curlies, we'll say sum plus equal country dot cost of living, and then we can simply return sum slash countries dot count. But if we do this, countries.count is, remember, an int, so we need to wrap countries.count in a double. That's because our sum value is a double, because we were adding up cost of living, which is also a double, and this should work great. Then we can copy this entire function, because our next function does pretty much the same thing. Paste it down below. We'll change the name of this new function to AVG restaurant index, and we're going to sum up instead in here the country.restaurant price index before it was cost of living. We're going to return the same thing in here, and this should work perfectly. Now, I also want to show you a little bit of functional programming in here, though. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight the for loop in the var that we have up here. I'm going to comment this out with a command slash. And I'm going to show you that we can use functional programming to sum up all of these values with just one statement instead of four. And we're going to do that with the reduce method. The reduce method lets us take a look at all of the values, in this case in an array, and then reduce them down to a single value based on a particular set of criteria. So in our example, what we're going to do is use the reduce function to reduce this array's average restaurant index value or property down to a single value, which is the sum of all of the average restaurant index values in the array. And here's how we do that. So we're going to reduce this down to a value. And in fact, because reduce takes things and puts it into a single value, we can actually create a constant in here. So we don't even need to use a variable. We'll say let sum equals countries.reduce. We see the definition down here returns the result of combining the elements of a sequence. In our case, the sequence is an array, using the given closure. So that's what's going to be between the curly braces. And I'm going to show you the shorthand here. So right after the word reduce, I'm going to put parentheses and a 0 inside. So that says this is the value that we start at as we start to reduce values down to a single particular criteria, a single particular value. In this case, a single particular number. And it's sort of the equivalent of how we set our sum variable in the commented outline above equal to 0 for starters. Now I'm going to set this equal to 0. That will be a double even though I didn't say 0.0. And then after the 0, so I say essentially start at 0, in the curly braces, I'm going to say, and again, this syntax is a little weird, $0 plus $1 dot restaurant price index. So what $0 says is take a look at the current value that we're reducing, and we're starting at 0, and then add that to the array elements dot restaurant price index. So what this is going to do is it's essentially going to add up all of the restaurant price indexes in the array and reduce them down to a single constant called sum. And so now that I have these two functions, I can use them in print statements. Print the average cost of living in Europe is string interp. And in that first string interp, I'm going to pass in average cost of living, the function that I just wrote, and countries is going to be countries. And in the second line, I'll say print the average restaurant price index in Europe is, and in the string interp here, I'm going to call average restaurant index, passing in countries as well. And then we do a shift return. We see that the average cost of living in Europe is 60.3197, a very large number, and we see the average restaurant price index is 56.390, again, very large number. I'm not sure what these index values mean. It doesn't matter. We also could have reduced this using the round method, but I didn't ask you to do that. Now on to question 8. Write a function labeled most expensive that accepts a single parameter named countries, which is an array of the country struct, and the function should calculate and return a single value, which is the name of the nation with the highest cost of living for all of the countries passed into this function. Then use the results of the function to print a statement like the one below, where XXX is the nation with the most expensive cost of living. The country with the most expensive cost of living is XXX. So we'll head back to Xcode. We'll put in our comment and print statements. Then func most expensive countries, and in parentheses countries colon, and then in brackets capital C country, and we're going to be passing a value back which is a string, so we draw our arrow with a dash greater than symbol, string, open and close curlies, and we're going to want to keep track of the most expensive country and the average cost of living in that country so that we can compare it with other countries. So initially what we'll do, since we don't have any values, is we'll create a value to hold the most expensive country. We'll set that equal to an empty string. Var most expensive equals empty string, and we'll create a value to hold the most expensive country's average cost of living, and we'll say var expense equals, and initially we'll set that to 0.0 since this is going to hold double values. Then we'll loop through all of the countries, and we're going to compare each country to the average cost of living value that we stored in expense. That should hold the most expensive cost of living value that we found so far. And if the country's expense, meaning the average cost of living, is greater than the current expense value, then we're going to update most expensive to that country's name and the expense field to that country's average cost of living. So again, the first technique that I'm going to show you is the technique that uses the for loop, but afterward, I'm also going to show you a technique that uses functional programming. So here we'll say for country in countries, and then in parentheses, we'll say if country.cost of living is greater than expense. Then in between curlies, we'll say expense equals country.cost of living, and most expensive equals country.name. Now, we didn't account for ties in here. That's okay. If you did account for ties in your question, that's great, but I didn't ask you to do that, and then we'll just return the most expensive value here, because that's all we wanted to do, was to return the name of the country with the highest cost of living. Then we'll just print out the most expensive country in Europe is string interp, and then inside this we'll call most expensive countries passing in countries. Then we run this, we see the most expensive country in Europe is Switzerland. Not surprising, those chocolates and watches cost lots of money, but question number 8 is done. Now, I did tell you I was going to show you how to do this much more efficiently by leveraging a type of functional programming, and this time we're going to use the map method. Now, this might be a little tricky to interpret when you look at it, but the map function is going to apply the same function or method that we're going to use to all of the items in our array. This also works with other collections too. So watch what we're going to do here. I'm going to say let expense, so we're going to boil everything down to an expense value here, which is going to be the most expensive country. And we'll say that equals countries.map. And then in between curlies, this is going to be what we're mapping. $0.cost of living. That means take a look inside this countries array and look at all of the cost of living properties. We're going to say after the curlies dot max. And remember what this does, this returns the maximum element in a particular sequence or a particular array. So we're going to say find the maximum value in all of the cost of living values in the country's array. So this will give us a double value, which is the largest cost of living. Now what we're going to do once we have that largest cost of living is we are going to search through the array, try to find the element in the array that has that particular number as the cost of living, and we're going to extract its name. And this is how we do that. We are going to use the first index method, which finds the first index in an array where a particular criteria is matched. So what we'll say here is let index of most expensive equals countries dot first index, and then in parentheses here we'll say where colon, and then in between curly braces we put in the criteria that we want to match. That criteria will be $0 dot cost of living, which means any element where the cost of living in the countries array equals expense. And what is expense? Well, expense is the maximum cost of living that we found out in the previous line. Now, there's a chance that the where criteria could return nil if we don't match the where criteria, but we're 100% certain that there is a cost of living element that has expense because that's what we extracted from the line above. So I'm just going to force unwrap this with an exclamation point at the end. Now remember, I want to return the name of the most expensive country, so in the return statement I can just say countries, and then in brackets, index of most expensive, close bracket, and then dot name. That'll give me the name of the most expensive country, and look what we did. We took the 8 lines of code that we had above and boiled them down to just 2 lines of code by using map and first index. Nice! So I didn't expect anybody to use those particular statements as the solution, but hopefully by reviewing the exam, you're learning a little bit too. Now for question number 9, we want to create a function called cheapest to visit, which is going to accept our array of country structs. And this function should calculate and return a single value that's the array index of the nation with the least expensive restaurant index for all the countries passed into this function. And then when we get that index, we're going to use the index to print out the statement, the nation with the least expensive restaurants is string interp. So back in Xcode, we'll add our comments and our print statements, and then we'll create our function with func cheapest country to visit, and in parentheses, countries colon, and in brackets, capital country, and we're going to draw our arrow with a dash greater than symbol, passing back. Oh, I wrote string in here, but we actually want to pass back an index, so we're going to change that to an int in just a bit. Sorry about that, I'll add a jump cut at the end editing the video. Then open and close curlies, and we'll say let cheapest equals, because we want to find the cheapest value, and we're going to use our map function. We'll say countries.map, and in between curlies we'll say $0 index, and outside of the curlies we'll say .min, open and close parens. Now again, I expected everybody to use the for loop technique that we initially demonstrated in the function above, but because I'm trying to teach a few things as we go over the exam, I also wanted to show you that we could reuse map and use a min function here as well. Then down in the next line, we're also going to get the index of the cheapest value, so we're going to say let index of cheapest equals, same technique we used above, countries.firstIndex, and then in parentheses where, and then after the colon in curlies, our where criteria is to return the first index where $0.restaurantPriceIndex equals cheapest. That's the value that we just found out above. Now once we have this value, we want to return the index. So we should have been returning index of cheapest here. As I'd mentioned though, I had a flub when I was recording this video. So here I have return countries and in brackets index of cheapest dot name. Really what we should have done is return the index. Then down below I have print the nation with the least expensive restaurant is string interp, cheapest country to visit, and then we're passing in countries as the value here, just to show you how we could fix this value the way that it was supposed to be. Apologies, I've got a jump cut in here, but it's the same code as we saw before, and I'm going to change the string that I was returning from this function to an int value, and I'm going to return index of cheapest, and what I'm going to do down here is in the string interp I'll say countries and then in brackets the return value from this function. Then close square brackets, that's going to give me the index value, and I need to put a dot name after this, and when I run this code we can see it refreshes down below. The nation with the least expensive restaurants is Kosovo, so if you'd like to eat out, go to Kosovo. So next up in question number 10, we're going to write a function region print that accepts two parameters, one which is countries, which is our array of the country struct, and the other is named region, which is a string that should represent one of four possible region names, n.Europe, s.Europe, e.Europe, and w.Europe. Now, what we want to do is we want to use this function to print the name of the region in all capital letters, followed by all of the countries in that region printed one at a time, ending with an additional blank line. So when we call the function, I show you down below what the output should look like. I don't show you all of the countries, so that's why I put a ... in here, but you get a sense of what we're after. So we'll have to call that function 4 times after we create the function, so let's go ahead and code this up. Then I'll start with our comment and some print statements. Then func, the function's name is region print. In parentheses, we're passing in countries, colon, and as we have been doing, in brackets, capital country, but 2 parameters this time, so comma, and then also region, colon, and this is going to be a string. Close paren, open and close curlies. Then inside, we want to print out the name of the region in all uppercase characters, so we'll do that with print. In between parentheses region, and we'll use the .uppercased method. Remember that? That was in our video and slides and reading. So what this does is it will uppercase every single character in the string. That's a function with no parameters, so it has open and close parens after it. Then we'll write a for loop that goes through all of our countries, and if the country's region property matches the region that we passed in, then we're going to print out that country's name. So we'll say for country in countries, open and close curlies, and if country.region equals region, then open and close curlies, print, and then in parentheses country.name. So we're not passing anything back. Let's just go ahead and call this region print countries, passing in countries, region. First we'll pass in the string n.Europe, then I'll copy this, paste it down 3 times, and change n to s, e, and w Europe. Do a shift enter to execute this, and let's take a look at the output, and this looks wonderful. I'll add an extra space in here so it looks clear, but Northern Europe goes from Denmark to United Kingdom, Southern Europe goes from Albania to Spain, Eastern Europe goes from Belarus to Ukraine, and Western Europe goes from Austria to Switzerland. Nice! Now, just to demonstrate functional programming techniques, I am going to comment out our for loop above. And first, I'm going to use a filter statement to create an array that just has the nations that are in that region. So I'm going to say let region countries equal countries.filter. And then in between parentheses, we have curlies. And we'll say $0.region equals region. So region countries has only the countries in that region. And then we can use forEach, which we learned very briefly in class. Remember, forEach will go through each element in the sequence, in the array in this particular case, and it will perform the statements that are in between the curly braces. The way to think about this is it performs the curly braces once for each element in the array. So I've typed out region countries. That's the array that we're going to perform our forEach on, region countries dot forEach. And there's a jump cut in here just to cut out an error that I'd made in the original version of the recording. This is the correct code that you're looking at right here. So for each element in region countries, we're going to print out that element's .name property. And once again, we see that we get the same output with dramatically less code by using functional programming. Again, hopefully you're learning some things by going through this solutions video as well. And now let's show the last question in the playgrounds portion of the test. And this is the most challenging question. So I'd advise students that if you got stuck, move on to the app after this and then come back. The goal was to write a function named prettyprint that accepts a single parameter named countries, which is, once again, an array of country structs. And we're going to assume that the font for printing is monospaced, and that should be what it is in the playground. And when we run the function, we should print out 4 columns of the 4 different regions as shown below. Now, what makes this tricky is some columns have fewer countries than other columns. So what we need to do is we need to find out what the largest country name is in every individual column and then add 1 space to it. And for every single column that we print out, or every single either the title or the name of the country itself, we need to pad it with that many number of blank spaces afterward. So that maximum size of the column minus the length of the title or the name that we're also going to be putting in that column. Now, we also need to loop through all of the values in the longest column. And for all the columns that aren't as long as the longest column, we'll just add padded space values before that column. So let's give this a try. In Xcode, we'll add our comments and our print statements. Then we'll define our function, prettyprint. And remember, we're passing in countries as the argument name, colon, and that's going to be an array of countries. So bracket, capital country, and close bracket, close parenthesis, open and close curlies. And the first thing that we're going to do is break the countries into 4 region arrays and find the longest name in each array. So I'm going to create an array var in Europe, colon, and that's going to be in bracket country because it's a type of array of country structs, and that'll be equal to open and close bracket. And I'm also going to create a value to hold the length of the longest country name in this column. So I'm going to call that var longest n name equals 0. Oops, I forgot the extra n in here. I'll fix that in just a bit. But first I'll highlight these 2 lines, copy them, paste them down below so that I do one for each direction of the compass. And then I'll make sure that I customize these for S Europe. There I'll add my N and longest S name, and E Europe, longest E name, and W Europe, and longest W name. Then I'm going to loop through all of the countries in my countries array. And in a switch statement, what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the different regions. I'm going to build out the different arrays that I created above N Europe, W Europe, E Europe, S Europe. And I'm also going to keep track of the number of the largest entry or largest country name that we find in each array. And so that's what's going in longest N name, longest S name, etc. So to loop through all the countries, I'll say for country in countries, open and close curlies, and then we're going to create a switch statement where we switch on country.region, open and close curlies. Then for our first case, we'll say case, and in quotes, N period, capital E Europe, and make sure that we put a colon at the end of this. And what we're going to do is we're going to take N Europe, that's that empty array that we created above that's going to hold all of our Northern European countries, and we'll say dot append, and then inside here we're going to pass in country. Then we're also going to check to see if this country name has more letters in it than the longest N name that we've recorded so far. So we'll do that with if country.name.count is greater than longest N name, open and close curlies. Then we update longest N name equals country.name.count. Now this case is for Northern Europe. I'm going to highlight all of these lines, copy them, paste them down below 3 times. That's for the 3 additional directions. Make sure that you have a default case in here. So just default colon, and we'll put a break in there. And I'll modify the case so that I've got one for Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe. Just make sure you modify your array variable and your longest name variable. It appears twice. Now below this, each region column should be one space plus the length of the longest name in that region. So to create the title line, what we want to do is we want to add the region title, so that's north, south, east, west, plus the number of spaces needed to create a length of the longest country name in the region plus 1. So we'll set that up below with var title, so this is going to print out our title line with north, south, east, west, and the appropriate number of spaces, equal to, and I'm going to write a special function, and I'm going to pass in two values. So it's either going to be the title value, and I'm eventually going to use this to pass in country names as well. And then the other parameter is going to be a number that represents the maximum number of characters that should be in this column. And so what I'll do is I'll take whatever title or country name that I pass in, and then I'll add a single space until I've reached the maximum size for a name in that column. So I'll create the helper function above this function. I'll call that spaced string. So I'll say func spaced string, and I'm going to pass in two parameters, title, colon, which is a string, comma, length, colon, which is an integer, and I'm going to pass back with my little arrow here, string, open and close curlies. Now I'm going to keep track of how many spaces I need to add. I'm going to create a variable var spaces equals empty string, and I'm going to add a space for every space that I need. And then what I'll go through is I'll add enough spaces at the end of title so that I create a column of the appropriate fixed maximum column size. And I can do that with for, and we won't need an index value here, so I can say underscore in 0 dot dot dot, and then in parentheses here I'll say length minus title.count, and I'll add 1 because we want to have that one space of padding at the end. And then in between curlies, we'll set spaces equal to spaces plus a single space character, so that's not an empty string, there's a single space there. And then after this for loop, we'll just return title plus spaces. Now, this is sort of a clunky way to do this, but from a logic standpoint, it actually reads really logically. It says, okay, go through and add a space for every value we need to add minus the number of characters that are in the title, plus 1 at the end, and just add the title and the spaces together. Now, we can actually write this with just a single line in it, and after we get everything working, I'll show you that shortcut. And by the way, we're using for statements and switch case statements in here. You probably know enough now about functional programming that you might think about trying to, stretch your knowledge and see if you can rewrite some of this using functional programming. But we're going to do this using just the basic logic that we learned on the first half of the course. And so now we set our var title equal to the function that we just created, or the return value for the function we created, spaced string, and we'll pass in all caps north for the title, and the length we'll pass in longest n name. And then below this, we'll say title plus equals, meaning title equals title plus. Spaced string, now we'll pass in south, all capital letters, and the length will be longest s name. Then below this, title plus equals spaced string, title in all caps east, and length longest e name, and we'll do the same down below. But you know what? We actually don't need to take advantage of the whole space string in here because the last column is our shortest column, and we don't need to pad this column since it's the last column at the end. We don't have another column that's coming after this. So what we can do here is just say title plus equals, in all caps, west. And then at this point, we'll print out title. That should print out north, south, east, west with the appropriate amount of spacing in between the columns. Then let's find and loop through the largest array. And then when we print out each row, we're going to make sure that we print all of the columns that surround this particular column. But if we reach at a point where in a particular array or a particular column there are no more country names, then we'll fill in that spot with the appropriate number of blank spaces. So in order to loop through enough times for the very largest array, we will find the length of the largest array, and we can do that with a max function. You could also have done that with for loops and if statements if you wanted to, but the max function lets us do this in just one line. So why don't we say let largest array equals max, and we can just pass in nEurope.count, sEurope.count, eEurope.count, and wEurope.count. Now we actually don't need the array itself, we just need the length of the array. So what we'll do is we'll say for I in 0 dot dot less than symbol largest array, which is the value that we just got above. That's the count of the largest array. And then in between curlies, we'll say var line equals empty string. So this is the same line that we're printing out each time, filling in the appropriate country name and the number of spaces. We'll start the line out with an empty string, but we'll add to it below. And then we'll loop through by saying if I is less than Northern Europe or nEurope.count, open and close curlies. This line essentially says, hey, is there a Northern Europe country for this column in the largest array? And if there is, we say line plus equals, and we'll take advantage of that spaced string function we wrote above. We'll pass in nEurope I.name. So that's going to be the particular country name for the north column at this particular row. And we'll also pass in the length of the longest northern region name. But then we'll add an else statement. And so this is what we'll do if we don't have a country name that matches the column that's the longest column in the 4 columns of the array. That means we need to fill it in with blank spaces. So we'll just say line plus equals space string. The title will be an empty string, so we're not adding anything to the beginning of this because we don't have a country at this point, and we'll just pass in longest n name. So now that we've got this if-else statement, we'll just copy it, paste it down below 3 times, and we'll make sure that we've got a version for Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe. And in fact, since Western Europe is the last column, we don't need to put any padding on the end, so we can just say line plus equals W Europe I.name. Then we'll print out line. That will print out 1 row in the 4 columns that we're printing out in this table. And I can tell by the end here that my curly braces are off. Let me look up. Oh yeah, I need to have a curly brace at the end of the case statement. We're going through a for loop here. Then I can delete the curly at the end. Then I'll Command A to highlight everything and Control I to reformat. And it looks like everything's aligned, and hopefully this executes okay. And so now let's call pretty print passing in countries, and we'll take a look at the output for this. And hey, look at that. We've got all 4 columns. They're formatted perfectly. Everything's looking good. So again, that was sort of complicated code, and we wrote more code than we needed to. Again, if you want to go back and you want to try things out using the different functional programming methods that we showed you early on, you can cut down on the number of lines in the code pretty dramatically, but I wanted to write things logically so that it was sort of the simplest way for us to think about this. But there are plenty of ways to refine this code. If you want to go through it more on your own as a refactoring exercise, have at it. What I'll show you is just one trick. I mentioned I was going to show you this in our spaced string function. Now we can actually compress this down so that we can just write one line, the return line, at the end of this function. And let me show you how we can do that. So first, just so that we can compare our code, I'm going to highlight and comment out all of the lines that are inside of this function. And watch what I'm going to do here. I'm going to type a line that just says return. And for functions that only have one statement in them that return a value, you actually don't need to have the keyword return in there, but I think you should put it in there. I think it makes your code more readable. And what we'll do is we'll return title plus, and watch what we're going to do. We're going to construct a string that's made up of a particular string that's repeated a certain number of times. And we can do that by typing in capital string, open parentheses. So this is going to create a brand new string. There's a selection repeating in here, so we'll select that. After repeating, we're going to put in what we want to repeat. So you can put in a whole string in here. Our string is just going to be a single space character. And then how many repeating single spaces do we want in this string? Well, we want it to be, in parentheses, length plus 1. Remember, we're passing in the length value up here, minus title.count. So that does everything that the for loop does, but we could do it all on a single line. And again, we had such little time together to learn really important Swift stuff that we didn't spend time on this particular string constructor, but it also hopefully is motivating you to dive in to learn more about the special things that we can do in Swift that can save us lots of time. If we go ahead and run this again, we see that we have the same result that we had before, our beautiful 4 columns formatted perfectly. So that was the first part of the exam, everything that was in the playground. In the next video, what we're going to do is cover the very simple app that was also part of this exam.